Welcome to Political Pandemonium 2020, a series of 4 workshops presented by the Technology and Social Change Research Project at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy of the Harvard Kennedy School. Hosted by Research Director Dr. Joan Donovan, these sessions explore the harmful effects of media manipulation on our society. Our third workshop, entitled Media Manipulation and the 2020 Election, Protecting Our Democracy, features Dr. Donovan in conversation with Jacobo Licona, disinformation researcher for Equis Labs, Dr. Jonathan Metzl, director of the Department of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University, and Bridget Todd, founder of Unbossed Creative. We hope you enjoy the video.
Hey everybody, welcome to the third installment of the Political Pandemonium 2020 series that we've been running here at the Shorenstein Center on media, politics, and public policy. We're a center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and our research focuses on a broad range of things. I run the Technology and Social Change Research project where we study media manipulation and disinformation, as well as AI and communication technology, and broadly speaking, any technological developments that have a significant impact on the way that people communicate and coordinate with one another. The reason why we've been running this series in the way that we have is that we're really happy to have you all join us for a small conversation. The first 45 minutes of the conversation are going to be recorded, and we will upload them to our Medium site. And we'll do a little bit of editing, but feel free if you want to usually it only records the speaker. But feel free if you want to shut down your video if you don't want to be seen. And then once we conclude the discussion period around 11:15, we'll then have a more broad discussion with all of you about the implications of what we discussed on contemporary politics, as well as the protest and the pandemic. I feel like we can't talk about what's happening in the election without talking about the pandemic. We can't talk about the pandemic without talking about the protests. We can't talk about the protests without talking about the election. So I see ourselves as having, in this moment, a very deeply intertwined and enmeshed set of concerns. And I am so excited to bring today's speakers together because these are folks who I respect deeply and have had the fortune to, over the years, either work with or be at conferences with, or be guests on some of their podcasts and webinars. So the first panelist that I want to introduce is Jacobo Licona, and he's a disinformation researcher at Equis Labs, which is a research and experimentation hub identifying new ways to reach and engage Latino voters. So it's primarily why do we need, one of the questions that Jacobo is always tasked with is like, why do we need disinformation researchers to be working in the midst of get out the vote campaigns? But right now, I think the question is rather obvious. Prior to working at Equis, Jacobo helped lead research efforts for 2 2020 presidential campaigns and various campaign committees, and he's provided research and communication support for progressive and Latinx organizations. And so we were really excited to have Jacobo here to talk to us about the nature of his research and its implications on the campaigns in 2020. Then we have Bridget Todd, who's the creator and host of iHeartRadio's critically acclaimed podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet. And I just love that title. She got her start teaching courses on writing and social change at Howard University. And then she trained human rights activists in Australia, as well as coordinated digital strategy for organizations like Planned Parenthood, the Women's March, and MSNBC, and ran a training program for political operatives that the Washington Post called the Democratic Party's Hogwarts for digital wizardry, which is a very apt title. And so we do have that deep contextual knowledge about, well, what happens when different groups are trying to get their messages heard, and how do disinformation campaigns seem to take up all the oxygen in the room. Formerly, she co-hosted iHeartMedia's Stuff Moms Never Told You About podcast, which was bringing feminist issues to 2 million ears a month, and hosted a global salon with Afropunk, where she talked to high-profile women like Ava DuVernay and the Me Too creator Tarana Burke. And so we're very excited to have Bridget here. And I know at some point, Dwight, if you could bring up the link to Bridget's most recent piece in Newsweek and drop it in the chat for people to read. I think that's a really apt piece on trying to understand how disinformation targets different communities. Disinformation campaigns and disinformers target different communities with very particular kinds of wedge issues and misinformation. Last but not least, a colleague, Jonathan Metzel, is a MD PhD, which means if you have a rash, he is available to tell you what it is. No, just kidding. Okay. Is the Frederick Rensselaer II Professor of Sociology and Psychiatry and the Director of the Department of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. He received his MD from the University of Missouri in humanities and poetics, and psychiatry internship and residency from Stanford. And then later, talk about education, got the PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan. He was the winner of the 2020 Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award and the 2020 APA, that's the American Psychology Association, Benjamin Rush Award for Scholarship, and the 2008 Guggenheim won the 2008 Guggenheim Fellowship. And he's written extensively for medical, psychiatric, and popular publications about some of the most urgent hot-button issues facing America and the world. And his books include The Protest Psychosis, which I read in graduate school, Prozac on the Couch, again, another book I read in graduate school, Against Health and How Health Became the New Morality, which I read after graduate school, and most recently, a book that I can't recommend enough, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. So I think we have a really great mix of talent and know-how for this discussion. And the bios obviously don't do justice to the personality and character and duty of care that each of these panelists feel towards our society. And so by way of just kicking off the conversation, I'd love to hear from each of you, what are you up to, in the moment? What has been preoccupying you over the past couple of weeks? In terms of how you've been approaching disinformation? Are there issues that you've been preoccupied with? Are there ways of, are the things that you've been writing, or what has kept your interest in this field as of now, and what do you want to make sure other people know in this moment so that we can kind of start to shape in our conversation today? And I'll start with Bridget.
Yes, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having us here today. I'm so excited. I would say what is really occupying my mind right now is the way that disinformation and misinformation targets marginalized communities. I think of myself as like a scholar of the internet. I grew up on the internet, and even for me, as someone who is online all the time, the ways in which it targets Black communities, Latinx communities is so savvy that oftentimes I find myself having to double check something myself. And so as someone who talks about disinformation, I'm often thinking about other folks, like the elders in my community, folks who are less digitally savvy. But it's a good reminder that, these manipulated forms of media are so good at, looking authentic that even I, someone who is on Twitter 24/7, can get fooled. So for me, it's really just making sure that folks in my communities of color, know that these attacks are going to be targeting us and understand sort of how to not spread them, right? Like it's really a challenge to sort of give folks the tools they need to identify and then say like, okay, well, here's how you avoid making them larger, making them bigger, and amplifying them. So definitely for me, the way that disinformation and misinformation impacts marginalized communities.
And I love the way that you frame this around, you know, how do you keep and protect the safety and integrity of your community? Because a lot of times disinformation requires us to play some kind of defense. But in order to go on the offense, I think you do have to have a strong base of trust within the groups that you're participating in online, specific online communities. Jacobo?
Yeah, so hi everyone. I mainly monitor the Latinx spaces, but I can just totally agree with what Bridget said. I think there's a lot of bad actors who are looking to create confusion and distrust to suppress votes. And they're really, you know, trying to create narratives that, you know, feed into fears and suspicions that they think maybe Spanish language voters or recent immigrants might have. And so we know that a lot of Spanish language voters tend to, you know, follow political news a little less closely. And so they're more susceptible to these kind of tactics. So, you know, there's a lot of disinfo getting pushed at the Latinx community as well as the Black community that is really meant to try to suppress the vote. But there's also a lot of, you know, racial tension where they're trying to divide communities. And we've been seeing it over the summer with Black Lives Matter movements and them trying to, you know, discredit the movement. But we also, you know, see specific examples of them using certain, you know, stories to divide the Black and Latinx community, which is, you know, a huge problem in and of itself that really needs to be addressed.
Mm. Excellent. And I think, yeah, Jonathan, you probably have a lot to say about how those divisions are exploited. So if you want to go next, I would appreciate it.
Absolutely. And let me apologize really quickly. I'm having some kind of internet problem, so I keep kind of coming and going. So if I freeze, I'll come right back on. And also, Joan, I'm sorry for making you read all that stuff in grad school. But
it's fine. I learned a lot. Look at where I am.
It's like, oh, this guy again. But you know, I'm working on two projects that are kind of related right now. I mean, one is I'm writing a piece for Somewhere about white anxiety and this idea that basically, you know, white quote unquote allies will support racial justice and protest as long as it doesn't make them uncomfortable. But the minute that happens, then it's kind of the nature of whiteness that they're going to, you know, shift, building off of some of the research from Wisconsin and other places that showed decreasing white support for Black Lives Matter protests after sensationalized disinformation campaigns about property destruction and other things like that. And so part of the argument I'm making in that piece is just showing that actually white anxiety is incredibly structural, that we actually don't understand it enough when we think that it's just some component of white people's brains, that they're automatically just going to turn on racial justice protests. That if we do that, we miss just the different structural levels that in which disinformation is conveyed to particularly white swing state voters who are undecided, susceptible, care more about law and order as a demographic group, things like that. And so I'm just trying to unpack a little bit what are the structures that shape this white anxiety narrative, as opposed to just saying, oh, it's just white people and that's the way they are. And I look at disinformation. I'm looking at a little bit of disinformation campaigns, at the structure of the electoral college process that actually amplifies the concerns of white swing state voters. Look at just the history of the relevance of these voters to presidential politics and things like that. And so partially I'm looking at disinformation and really urging people to take it seriously, because I think that, to be honest, we haven't done enough. And if those voters matter and we want to get in and change the system, we actually have to come up with a particular counter rather than just saying, oh, there go white people again. And so part of it is like, how can we counter the disinformation campaigns that really foment and create white anxiety, and particularly now around law and order themes, which I think are unfortunately effective. But since we know they're effective, what's the particular counter? And then the second part is, unfortunately, after the death of RBG, looking at messaging about healthcare, if that's where the Democrats are going to make their stand about this Supreme Court case, and really thinking a lot about really, honestly, I'm just honestly terrified that the Democrats are going to fall back into the same trap of just standing up for vague terms like pre-existing conditions and not really making what healthcare means material in very, very material ways that counter the disinformation that's going to come out about if the ACA becomes the debate for the SCOTUS case. And so I'm trying to also write a piece about messaging around healthcare that doesn't just reproduce the ACA debate, which is a very polarizing debate.
Mm-hmm. No, that I definitely feel there's been a lot of talk on our research team about what are going to be the constellation of wedge issues that are going to mobilize voters in this moment, given that the death of Ginsburg really throws a different set of conditions, you know, front and center, especially reproductive rights, right, as well as healthcare, and that the consequentialness of this particular pick at this time is something that I think researchers need to address and need to understand, because one of the things that all of our research together really needs to parse is not just that disinformation has partisan angles, but really good disinformation campaigns aren't necessarily partisan, they're polarizing. That is, they try to take a concern that certain communities have, maybe all communities have, and they try to structure that concern in a way that makes gray, you know, the nuance and the gray areas of that concern disappear. So when we say that disinformation polarizes, what we know of how Russia tried to play different social movements off of each other in 2016 is they weren't just, you know, targeting lefty or Democrat groups and saying, you know, the right is bad. And they weren't just targeting the right and saying, oh, the left is bad. They really tried to hone in on certain issues that were important. And so they would be both pro-trans and anti-trans groups. They'd be pro-Muslim groups and anti-Muslim groups. And they'd really be trying to drive a wedge. But then when we start to look within communities, there are things that all Latinx people don't agree on, and all Black people don't agree on, right? And all white people don't agree on. And as such, it presents itself with a disinformation opportunity, right? Where you can, if you can force a wedge issue into public discussion, you can attach to it different pieces of disinformation. Like take, for instance, the mail-in voting campaigns right now. Who would have thought mail-in voting would become such an important issue? It seems nonpartisan. It seems as if, yeah, you would want everybody to vote and you would want them to vote safely. And in the midst of a pandemic, you would want people to think, okay, my option here to stay safe is to vote by mail. I'm going to start with you, Jacobo. How has that issue shown up in Latinx spaces online in terms of what are people saying about mail-in voting that is both you know, maybe true concerns that people might have, and then how has disinformation really attached itself to those concerns and amplified divisiveness?
Yeah, so I think in the Latinx spaces specifically, there's a lot, it probably kind of follows with a lot of what's being seen by the broader far right, where I think what they do is like they cherry pick specific instances of like maybe, you know, a voter fraud instance, and then they amplify that as like kind of like evidence of a trend, and then they kind of, you know, spread this fear of vote by mail to make it seem like it's not safe or reliable by, you know, cherry picking that one instance. But one thing that I've noticed in some of these more far right Latinx spaces is that they tend to coordinate a lot of these attacks. So they'll, you know, share this one story at the same time to obviously, you know, get more people to see it. But there's a lot of coordination around this. And then also some of the Spanish language users, they do a lot of, you know, videos in Spanish where they specifically talk about the fear of vote by mail or that you have to vote in person. So I think that while there's some instances where, you know, there's potentially some concern about vote by mail, they use that instance to basically, you know, make it a trend and make it seem like that this is a huge problem and that we should not be voting by mail, or that there could be fraud happening. Or sometimes you even see claims where like the left is trying to do vote by mail to you know, interfere in the election.
Mm-hmm. Bridget, did you want to follow up on that and talk a bit about how vote by mail is showing up in your world?
Definitely. Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, that, you know, in the Black community, we've had disinformation around voting. Like, it's always been a thing. When I was growing up, the popular sort of rumor that I often would hear was that when you would go to vote, they would do a check for like outstanding warrants and outstanding child support. Clearly, these things are meant to target Black anxieties, right? And so that was something that like a myth that I grew up hearing. And so it's very interesting how those same kind of like fear tactics have just sort of intensified around vote by mail. You know, just today I had a conversation with my father where he was like, oh, I heard that if you do mail-in voting, it doesn't even really count, so there's no reason to even send it in. You know, so many different ways that we are told that either voting by mail is not safe, voting by mail doesn't really count, so there's no real reason to even do it. Clearly, you know, these things are not true, but I think they really play into these long-standing kind of community tensions and anxieties around, you know, around sort of the government not taking our issue seriously, not really hearing us, and targeting us. And so what's interesting to me is how this disinformation really does sort of play on these like very understandable fears that our country and our government, you know, is not here for us. It really plays on those fears to spread, you know, disinformation and say like, oh, well, this is why you shouldn't even bother to vote, because they're not even if you send it in, they're not even going to count it, so why bother? It's really something that's quite insidious.
Mm-hmm. No, and I agree with you with that move around, you know, exacerbating longstanding mistrust with, you know, both. We see this in the medical misinformation as well, where, you know, we do have, you know, within Black communities a history of medical experimentation being carried out, and at the same time, you know, the fight to vote, to be able to vote, to have access, has definitely caused folks to be very skeptical of a system. Whereas it seems like that is also somewhat a little bit different from the Latinx experience of trying to understand vote by mail, because the Latinx experience to me also seems to cut across, you know, different divisions, especially around this notion that there is a specific motive behind vote by mail, that, you know, one party is going to benefit over the other, whereas in Black communities it might be using disinformation to cause voter apathy.
Definitely.
You know, in the Latinx instance, we're hearing more about, you know, this kind of conspiracy model to cause distrust in someone else, not necessarily the system, but that the system is going to be rigged by other groups. And Jonathan, if you're still here, let me just double check on my screen here. You might have disappeared. I know he was having. Dwight, do you see him, or did he have to bow out? Okay.
He's gone temporarily.
Temporarily. What a shame. Because I think he has a really important point to make about anxiety here. But I do want to stress that sometimes as we start to pick apart disinformation campaigns, we start to see different messaging being utilized in terms of trying to promote that kind of division and trying to land people in different spaces, be it in terms of apathy, saying, well, it hasn't counted, it's never going to count, and you know, and for a lot of people, the fear of coronavirus is very real, the risk is very real, and so the idea of going to vote in person is very risky. And if you can't mobilize people to vote by mail, the other option is also a non-starter. Jonathan, welcome back. I wanted to talk with you a bit about how Vote by Mail and the entire the integrity of the voting process is being wedged or is showing up in your research. What is white people's concerns with this moment and the different options that we have for voting at this stage, and how is anxiety playing a role in that?
Well, I'm glad to be back. I'm on my phone now, so hopefully this will work a little bit better. Um, again, it's important to note. I think this is the point of what everybody else is saying, that white people are obviously not a monolithic group here, and so finding wedge issues that will play into established themes, I think, is relatively easy. It's crazy how effective they are, and I'm reminded at this moment of two other moments from my research. One is when the Affordable Care Act first came out in 2010. We were doing a bunch of focus groups around the South. And when the ACA first came out and people were learning, oh gosh, there's Medicaid expansion, that's going to be great. And everybody was excited about it, including conservative white people. And then they started these targeted, messages that were basically, it's government intrusion, and it's the government's going to do this. And the other main thing was, Black people are going to have 12 kids, and they're going to take your tax money, and you just played into these racial scripts. And the minute they started doing that, overnight, people who were like jumping for joy about getting healthcare, it was just incredible how effective that particular kind of message was, that undeserving immigrants and minorities are going to game the system, a very, very powerful theme, and about government overreach and intrusion. And it turned people against their own healthcare. And I saw it play out in the mask debate also. 8 months ago, who gave a hoot about a mask? It, pretty much costs $1 and it'll save your life. Why not? And in the beginning, I think there was openness, and then exactly the same machine took over, which is, oh, this is a minoritized issue. It's government overreach. They can't control me. And I see the exact same thing happening with this mail issue, that it's playing into deep racial fault lines about somebody else is gaming the system and you're going to be the victim. And of course, it doesn't work on all white people, or probably most white people, but it works on enough white people to change the conversation, give you a sensationalized media story that can then look like it's everybody. And especially because these are messages that are particularly targeting white people in swing states where the election is deadlocked right now, and where the election will be decided. It's particularly effective because they don't care if people in New York and LA believe this nonsense, but if people in Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, if they believe it, then it's going to potentially shift the election. So people have to realize that it's very targeted for a particular reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think that one of the things we're learning here is that not just that it's targeted racially and ethnically, but also by region. And so let's talk a bit about the socio-technical system that kind of brings this all together. That is, the social media platforms that we all rely on for timely, local, relevant information have been weaponized by different interest groups for different purposes. And so whereas people have been very concerned in the past with Russian disinformation campaigns, and we have the CIA now coming out saying that it is probably that there are disinformation campaigns being directed by Putin towards specific ends. One of the things that we haven't really reckoned with quite a bit is also the disinformation campaigns that are, domestic, right? And the reason why people do separate out the foreign and domestic component has a lot to do with, what are the purposes of political speech? And so we are supposed to have a very robust political discussion about issues that matter within the US with people who live here and are affected by those policies. But the internet, and especially social media platforms, have created this very open environment where anybody can pretend to be anybody. I often say this thing, why be something that you're not? And sometimes the answer to that is money, political power moving the issue that you care about most. And sometimes it's just general chaos, you know, folks that are nihilistically like really black pilled on society and are just like, I have significant things to gain by just creating distractions, by creating a feeling of uneasiness, by, exploding the chaos. And as we start to think about, well, you know, how have platform companies dealt with this? They've installed different fact-checking organizations. They've tried to move the issue by adding labels to their content. I remember back, we have Ryan here from Wikipedia on there, so I have to mention this. YouTube was just like, we're just going to put the Wikipedia article on our videos so that people know what the truth is. And of course, that then shifts the burden to Wikipedia to be the arbiter of truth. And so, you know, there are ways in which these social media companies have tried to really offload the burden of these disinformation campaigns and the responsibility to other companies, to fact checkers. But by and large, it doesn't really deal with the problem. And so I would love to start with you, Bridget, just to hear a little bit about, you know, if we do have to be concerned with, you know, protecting our connected communities, you know, is there a strategy that you've started to work on that you want to, you know, encourage other people to think through or maybe to adopt, especially as we think about, you know, what can civil society do or what can people do now in the moment to try to raise awareness and to try to be good stewards of information?
Definitely. It's such a good question. I want to be very clear that I think that platforms have a responsibility to do more and they are failing. And so it really is like a failure of their leadership to take this issue seriously and act on it. I used to think that they were like they were not taking this issue seriously but now I sort of think that like they have made a deliberate choice to not do that, especially platforms like Facebook. They've made a choice that this is, you know, how it's going to be. And so I think in absence of their failure of leadership, all of us, every citizen needs to understand disinformation and understand how to combat it. And by that, I mean, understanding how you become a trusted source of good, accurate information in your community, right? Like, I think that every person needs to think of themselves as kind of an influencer or a media organization that knows how to check information to make sure that it's right and putting out positive, accurate information. And it is a little bit tough because, you know, it's a bit like climate change where, you know, individual behavior is important, but really, you know, those in charge, people with power, people with money should be doing more. But in absence of them stepping up, I do think all of us have a responsibility to make sure that we are being good stewards of accurate information. And I think that, you know, I've seen so many different regular people step up, you know, folks like Shafika Hudson, who created the hashtag You're Still Showing to stamp out bad actors who were pretending to be Black women on Twitter to just sort of, as you said earlier, kind of just like spread general chaos and confusion and, you know, just general distrust online. I think that in instances where everyday people feel empowered and feel like it is their duty to sort of do something, I think that's really important. And you know, we don't have to wait for platforms or, you know, tech leaders to do the right thing. We can sort of, in absence of their leadership, we can step up and do it for them.
Mm-hmm. No, I more and more am starting to realize how critical it is for us to have a strategy for just the individual to the sort of medium level organization all the way up to national organizations. And for so long, research has focused so much on journalism because journalists by and large are the #1 target for disinformation campaigns. And so it's really important then that we start to develop strategies to counter message and mitigate what's going on. Because I think if you don't do that, or if you don't give people a toolkit or a way to participate in this, then they just feel as if they are sort of passively receiving all of this information.
definitely. I should say that the organization that I work with, Ultraviolet, we created a disinformation toolkit, really for journalists and media, but really also for anybody to identify racist, sexist disinformation and misinformation. So things like associating, like things like calling Kamala Harris angry, or things like focusing on, you know, what a female candidate, what her voice sounds like, you know, all of these things that perpetuate gendered, sexist, racist attacks. So I'll be happy to drop that in the chat. And then something else I just want to say is that, Dr. Donovan, your work around the way that disinformation works, especially on Twitter, was so informative for me. Like, one of the things that you write about is these videos of like white women behaving badly, you know, Karen videos. And I definitely, before I read some of your work on this, was the kind of person who, when I saw a video of a white lady like behaving badly in public, wanted to share it, wanted to make sure that people saw this. And then the suggestion that, like, well, where are these videos coming from? Like who out there has a interest in me having a really big emotional response and slamming that share button, right? The idea that I personally, Bridget, would like take a moment and think about the emotional reaction I was having before I just like rushed to share really was sort of the aha moment where I thought, oh, I have a hand to play in this, you know, not just as somebody who is, you know, like a scholar of the internet, just as a person who, you know, scrolls Twitter casually. So I think really getting folks to understand, like, when you have that thing in your brain that is telling you like share, or like, you know, get involved and like amplify this, really taking a beat and unpacking that feeling, sitting with that feeling, like that was very informative for me, just personally and professionally.
Yeah, and I recently wrote about this in terms of what we call in the business riot porn, and this notion of like why we would see an overabundance or an overfocus on violence in social movements rather than, you know, what usually happens, which is people show up, they talk, they do some chanting, they go home. But no journalist covers that because that is not considered a story. But that's the overwhelming, like 99% of protests look and feel that way. Jonathan, I want to go to you now and talk a little bit about, and we're going to be wrapping up here with the speakers, and then we'll go into a discussion. You know, in your line of work, as you're starting to uncover and write about the structures that are driving you know, white people's anxieties around law and order, and how this is potentially going to influence the way in which they both participate online or they assess their risk with the pandemic. Are there key takeaways that we should be thinking about and shaping our you know, our worlds toward, so that we can hopefully try to mitigate some of the damage that's already been done?
Well, I think the other panelists have made great points here. I think that really part of the issue is how effective these things are, right? In other words, if they were just selling us like a pair of shoes we didn't need, it would be fine. But they're so effective at playing both sides, at finding deep issues that are really, you know, creating anxiety. And it's really, I think Bridget's point is right on, which is that it's much easier to see the disinformation that is going toward, like, quote unquote, the other side. But most people think the other side is affected, and they're not, right? So I think that in a way, part of the issue for me is, instead of just saying, oh, those dumb white Trump supporters, look, they're falling for this thing, I think you have to step back and say, like, what is the button that's being pushed there? And then how can you potentially change the channel, right? Because I used to study for the pharmaceutical industry, and I studied the gun industry, and these guys have known this for years. They co-opt actual protest movements. Like when I was studying pharmaceuticals, I did a project on hormone replacement therapy, and the pharmaceutical company bought the opposition and took their name, and then was putting out stuff in the name of, like, women against HRT or something. So they're definitely playing both sides. And so part of the issue is to be very, very self-reflective. The other thing I think is important, just riffing off of what Bridget said, is, you know, stuff like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, it was just supposed to be like the salt. It wasn't supposed to be like the full meal of human interaction. And really what we're seeing now is, in the pandemic, when people are socially distanced, these social media outlets are playing a role that they really wouldn't play otherwise, which is, usually you go to work and you engage with people, you go to the gym, you meet other people. So right now these conduits are so profoundly amplified. I think there are two options for how to go forward with that. I mean, one, of course, is to call it when it happens. But I also think, given the, just for me, the stuff I study, the predictability of like the anti-government message, the control message, I find a little bit of frustration. How come we can't change the channel when it's it's so predictable? I mean, it's just like the mask thing. I watched this play out and I thought, here we go again, just like people protesting against their own healthcare. So can't we potentially change the channel, use these same networks to actually promote other kinds of messages? I realize they're really powerful, but I'm working with a group now called Millions of Conversations that actually uses, tries to correct disinformation with other kinds of message. And part of it is like, when that message comes out, like we're seeing it today with Biden's son, for example, all this random crap that we've already known about for a million years. What's your intervention strategy? At that moment, you need an intervention strategy to change the channel, which has to do with providing other kinds of messages, making sure people see it, making sure those messages are promoted by trusted messengers, and creating some other story that is almost like a quick action team, a quick action strike force, that's not going to let the whole news be about Biden's son today, but instead is about like, oh yeah, here's another way to understand it, or something like that. So you need a response team, a mass unit, and I just don't think we've had that, and it's frustrating.
No, and I agree with you. And I might be part of the problem there, where some of the research that I've done has been conflated. So the research that I've done on white supremacy that says, hey, don't interview white supremacists for your article, don't give them a new platform to speak, is advice given to journalists, which has now been sort of shifted in a way to be given to a lot of folks, to say, oh, nobody should engage with any disinformation online. And I think I agree with you that we do need to have civil society strategies. Last night I was in conversation with Audrey Tang, who's the digital minister of Taiwan right now, and they employ what's called humor over rumor. So one of the other ministers has a dog, a Shiba Inu, and when disinformation happens, that person goes and takes a new picture of the dog, but it becomes a kind of meme where the dog is then dispelling the disinformation. And so they make a quick content card and they try to be within an hour of the disinformation, but that also relies on a social trust that people have generated with the current Taiwanese government, who has pledged increasing transparency. But I love the notion of humor over rumor because it does allow people a space to take action. And
could I say one thing about that?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
I think it's not that audiences don't have people they trust, right? They might not trust the government, but they might trust Dolly Parton or a country music star or something like that. And so part of the trick here is figuring out who is a trusted messenger who could convey that information and partnering with them. It doesn't have to be the government.
No, and I agree. I feel like it would be a disaster in the US if we started with the government for so many reasons. But maybe mid-level governments or local officials might be to win the day. But I agree with you. The culture industry is one that we haven't really engaged with enough. But think about all of the sports, stars who've come out in favor of Black Lives Matter and have really force the organizations that they work for to also take those stances with the NFL. And I know that there's a lot of hand waving about this being merely symbolic, but I also do think that it helps people understand that politics is a feature of all of society. It's an all of society problem. And when we're confronting deep social issues like the history of racism in America and the continued advancement of white supremacy, that it's up to key figures that people see as role models. I also see sports stars as having a role to play with upping the broad social responsibility to wear masks. If people who are extremely physically fit and at the top of their game are also very concerned with sickness and health, that we can also advance some more pro-social messaging. Jacobo, before I give a chance for y'all to bow out, I would love to hear from you a bit about what Eki's lab has been doing with the research that you've been working on, and how, you know, by virtue of some of the research that you've done, I know on a disinformation targeting Latin communities in Florida, we've actually gotten journalists to start covering it, to take a look more deeply at how this is coming together. And so I'd love to hear you to talk a little bit about where this is going for you all.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, a lot of people in the political space and a lot of journalists have been talking a lot about Florida, and specifically Latinx voters in Florida. We've seen a lot of recent polling showing Florida tightening, and that's partly driven by Hispanic voters. So, like, you know, in 2012, Obama and Romney were essentially split between the Cuban vote, but we've seen polling showing Trump leading Biden among the Cuban population. And I think part of that reason is the right's narrative about this like perceived threat of socialism, and they often connect it to Biden and the Democrats. And, you know, it's not just online. Trump goes to Florida all the time and he talks about socialism, or the GOP convention. We saw a lot about this fear of socialism and that the Democrats are going to bring this to the country. Also, a lot of like narratives around like violence and chaos and unrest, which I think it actually really hits home for a lot of Latinos, especially Cubans and Venezuelans, who, you know, have this real fear of socialism. I think it's important for us to, you know, pivot to proactive messages around like what a, you know, progressive administration would do, or like why. I mean, it's kind of, you know, I think it's a stretch to claim that Biden is like a socialist dictator, but we see that all the time. So I think it's like important for us to pivot to proactive messaging and make sure that we're, you know, explaining, if you're a progressive group or if you're like a supporter of the Democratic Party, to like to explain how, what a Biden administration would be for the Latino community, or how a progressive, you know, agenda benefits the Latino community, including Cubans, including Venezuelans, including people who are fleeing socialist countries. And, you know, making sure that some of these narratives are like the radical left, or these ideas are, you know, not necessarily combating them directly, but, you know, going to our messages of this progressive agenda.
Mm. Yeah, because it's definitely, you know, that once disinformation, you start to see the patterns in it, you can understand the trends. You know, for people like me who, you know, pay attention to politics, I know Biden's not a socialist. He's got a track record, you know, several decades of a track record that points not in that direction. But I can see how it might be compelling as a talking point for people to think that, you know, especially when they're being fed advertising, both through social media and through radio ads and local television, to say that somehow Biden is part of the radical left. And it's really hard then, as Jonathan and Bridget have shown us, to get your messages across in a much, you know, not even just counter messaging, but you know, messaging that is either truthful or has that political spin, especially when politicians are falsely associated with certain political issues. And so that's what's important to understand here, is that you know, at what point is it no longer political spin when the dominating messages that people are receiving is that Biden is some kind of socialist, or that, you know, or like in the case of medical misinformation, that masks are, you know, government control and overreach, you know, or in the case of, you know, accessing medical care during the pandemic, that you're getting mixed messages about how much it's going to cost and what the rationale is, and so what the access points are. Sorry. And so I want to say thank you to our panelists for coming and talking with me and being part of this discussion. I know some of you have to break out to other meetings, and I've kept you even longer than I promised not to. But I really, really appreciate y'all coming. And then for the rest of us, we're going to stay on the line and have a discussion about what we heard today and other questions that you may have about disinformation. And we're going to talk a bit about how disinformation is showing up in the 2020 election cycle. So I just want to say thank you to the panelists, and feel free to either stay or drop off at this point.